My name is Celine Silva. I'm 38 years old, and for nearly 2 decades I worked as a forensic document examiner. My job was never glamorous. I spent most of my days comparing signatures, analyzing ink, studying paper fibers, and proving whether a document had been altered or forged. While other people relied on instinct, I relied on evidence. Facts never changed because someone became emotional. That career shaped the way I viewed people. I learned that lies often looked convincing at first glance, while the truth usually hid inside the smallest details. Years before the events I'm about to tell you, I met Professor Aldrich Henshaw. He wasn't related to me by blood. He became my mentor after hiring me to authenticate thousands of historical records that he had collected throughout his lifetime. Those records filled nearly every room inside his countryside manor. Old government reports, engineering blueprints, court filings, handwritten journals, and forgotten correspondence from decades earlier lined shelves from floor to ceiling. Most visitors saw an old collector with too much paper. I saw someone who understood that documents could change the course of history. Working beside Professor Henshaw slowly became more than a career. I admired his discipline, his patience, and his refusal to destroy records simply because they made powerful people uncomfortable. Every document had a story, and every story deserved to survive. There was another person you need to know. His name was Draven Quill Ashcombe. If you met him for the first time, you would probably like him immediately. He dressed with quiet elegance, spoke with confidence, remembered everyone's names, and always seemed perfectly composed. Newspapers described him as a successful entrepreneur who specialized in commercial redevelopment. Charity organizations praised his generous donations. Local politicians welcomed him into every public event. But every conversation I ever had with Draven left me uneasy. He rarely asked about Professor Henshaw's health. Instead, he asked about the manor, about the storage buildings, about the underground utilities, about inventory lists, about ownership records. Questions that sounded harmless on their own. Questions that became stranger every time he visited. Professor Henshaw noticed it too, although he never confronted Draven directly. Instead, he simply watched. Looking back now, I realize he was waiting to see how far someone's curiosity would go when it was driven by ambition instead of affection. At that time, none of us imagined how quickly everything would change. 3 weeks before the will reading, Professor Aldrich Henshaw passed away after a brief illness. His death spread through the family much faster than I expected. During the years I worked beside him, very few relatives ever visited the manor. Birthdays came and went without phone calls. Holiday dinners were often canceled because someone was too busy. Medical appointments were usually attended by employees rather than family members. Yet within 48 hours of his funeral, the manor suddenly became crowded. Luxury vehicles filled the long gravel driveway from sunrise until evening. Relatives I barely recognized walked confidently through rooms they had ignored for years. Some inspected paintings. Others opened cabinets. Several quietly discussed property values while standing only a few feet away from the room where Professor Henshaw's personal belongings remained exactly as he had left them. I stayed out of their conversations. Grief affected people differently. Still, something about the atmosphere felt wrong. No one talked about the professor himself. No one shared stories. No one laughed while remembering happier times. Every discussion eventually returned to one subject: the estate. At the center of nearly every conversation stood Draven Quill Ashcombe. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. People naturally gathered around him, waiting for his opinion before making decisions. He spoke as though he had already accepted the responsibility of managing everything Professor Henshaw left behind. The manor has enormous potential. The land alone is worth a fortune. We should move quickly before maintenance costs become excessive. His words sounded practical, efficient, reasonable, yet something inside me refused to relax. Professor Henshaw had spent decades protecting every document inside this estate. Why did everyone suddenly care more about the buildings than the man who filled them? I couldn't answer that question.
Not yet.
About 6 months before Professor Henshaw passed away, we stayed late inside his private archive room. Outside, Steady rain tapped against the tall windows while I finished cataloging another stack of government engineering reports. Professor Henshaw wasn't working. He simply stood beside one of the shelves, quietly looking across the room. After several minutes, he finally spoke. "Celine." I looked up from the documents. "If something ever happens to me," he paused long enough for me to notice the seriousness in his expression. "Promise me you won't argue over this estate." I frowned. "I don't understand." "You will." He slowly walked toward the window before continuing. "There are people who believe ownership is the same as victory." His voice remained calm. "Let them believe that." I waited for him to explain. He never did. Instead, he smiled faintly before changing the subject and returning to work as though the conversation had never happened. At the time, I assumed he was thinking about old age. I never imagined he was preparing me for what would happen after his death. Those words stayed with me. I repeated them in my mind more than once during the weeks that followed. Only much later would I realize they were not advice. They were instructions. The attorney scheduled the official reading of Professor Henshaw's will for Friday morning at his downtown office. As the date approached, every member of the family seemed unusually confident. Some discussed renovation plans before anyone had inherited a single room. Others talked openly about selling portions of the property. Draven remained the calmest of them all. When our eyes met across the manor's entrance hall the evening before the reading, he offered me a polite smile. It looked like the smile of someone who already knew the outcome. I simply nodded in return, because while everyone else believed the real battle would begin inside the lawyer's office, I had the strange feeling Professor Henshaw had already decided the winner long before any of us took our seats. Friday morning arrived under a gray sky. Downtown traffic moved slowly as I drove toward the law office, where Professor Henshaw's will would finally be read. The building itself reflected the firm's reputation: quiet, understated, and meticulously maintained. Dark wood panels lined the reception area, framed legal certificates covered nearly every wall, and the staff greeted everyone with the same practiced professionalism. I signed my name on the attendance sheet before taking a seat near the far end of the conference room. One by one, the heirs arrived. Some smiled politely. Others barely acknowledged my presence. It didn't take long before conversations shifted toward assumptions rather than questions. "I wonder how quickly we can put the manor on the market. The land alone should attract developers. I've already spoken with a valuation company." No one spoke about Professor Henshaw. His photographs weren't displayed. His accomplishments weren't mentioned. His funeral had ended less than a month earlier, yet the atmosphere felt more like a business acquisition than the closing of someone's life. Draven Quill Ashcombe entered last. He carried himself with the same calm confidence I had seen for years. He greeted the attorney by name. He shook hands with several relatives. When his eyes met mine, he offered another courteous smile. "You look surprisingly relaxed, Celine." "I slept well." "I'm glad. These things can become emotional." "I suppose they can." His smile lingered for a moment before he took his seat at the head of the family side of the table. No one questioned why he chose that position. By then, everyone already treated him like the unofficial leader. At precisely 9 o'clock, Attorney Malcolm Everidge entered carrying a thick leather folder. He waited until the room became completely silent before speaking. "Thank you all for attending." He briefly reviewed the legal procedures before opening the sealed envelope that contained Professor Henshaw's final will. For nearly an hour, he read through charitable donations, professional acknowledgments, maintenance trusts, and various financial instructions. Everything matched Professor Henshaw's personality: detailed, organized, specific. Then the attorney reached the section everyone had been waiting for. The countryside manor, surrounding acreage, storage facilities, historical collections remaining on site, and all associated structures shall transfer jointly to the surviving legal heirs listed herein. A wave of satisfaction spread across the room. Several relatives exchanged excited glances. One quietly whispered, "I knew it." Draven leaned back in his chair. Not triumphantly, confidently, as though the document had merely confirmed what he already believed. The attorney continued reading legal descriptions of the estate before finally closing the folder halfway. "There remains one procedural matter. His eyes shifted toward me. Miss Celine Silva. As Professor Henshaw's designated professional representative, you have the legal standing to contest specific transfers should you choose. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward me. The room became completely silent. For several long seconds, nobody moved. I could almost feel everyone waiting for an argument. Some expected accusations. Others expected hidden evidence. A few looked genuinely nervous. Draven remained perfectly composed. Perhaps he believed I would challenge the will. Perhaps he had prepared for that possibility. Attorney Everidge repeated the question. Do you wish to contest the distribution? I looked around the room. Years earlier, Professor Henshaw had asked me to make one promise. Do not argue over the estate. At last, I answered.
No.
The silence somehow became even heavier. I accept Professor Henshaw's wishes exactly as written. Several heirs blinked in surprise. One woman quietly laughed with relief. Another leaned toward her husband and whispered something I couldn't hear. Draven smiled. It was the broadest smile I had ever seen from him. I appreciate your professionalism, Celine. I've always respected clear instructions. So have I. Those words sounded harmless. Only one of us knew how true they really were. Within the next 2 hours, every required document was signed. Ownership transfers began immediately. The heirs congratulated one another inside the hallway. Several were already discussing renovation companies and investment opportunities. Someone suggested hosting a celebration dinner at the manor before the end of the month. Another proposed dividing certain antiques among family members. The excitement spread quickly. Meanwhile, Attorney Everidge quietly approached me. Without attracting attention, he slid a plain cardboard archive box across his office desk. No labels. No decorations. Only my name written neatly in black ink. I was instructed to release this only after the estate transfer became official. I understand. Professor Henshaw was very clear. I know. I lifted the box. It wasn't particularly heavy. To anyone watching, it looked completely ordinary. Old paperwork. Perhaps personal notes. Nothing valuable. No one in the hallway paid the slightest attention as I carried it toward the elevator. Draven passed me near the building's entrance. That's all you're taking? Apparently. You don't seem disappointed. I received exactly what Professor Henshaw intended. He gave a satisfied nod. So did we. I wished him well before walking toward my car. Only after leaving downtown did I allow myself one brief glance inside the archive box. Its contents confirmed something Professor Henshaw had planned months before his death. The estate the heirs had fought so eagerly to obtain was no longer the estate they believed they had inherited. That evening, celebrations continued at the countryside manor. Music echoed through rooms that had been silent only weeks earlier. Champagne bottles were opened. Future renovation plans filled every conversation. From a distance, it looked like a family finally coming together. In reality, they were celebrating a victory they didn't yet understand. As for me, I drove in the opposite direction with the plain archive box secured beside me. For the first time since Professor Henshaw's funeral, I felt completely calm. I hadn't lost anything. I had simply followed his instructions. And if he had predicted everything correctly, the real inheritance had only just begun. 4 days passed after the will reading. The heirs wasted no time taking control of the manor. Construction trucks rolled through the front gate before sunrise. Surveyors measured the property boundaries. Contractors carried equipment into rooms that had remained untouched for decades. According to the renovation permits filed with the county, the work involved structural reinforcement, electrical upgrades, and roof repairs. That explanation sounded reasonable, until I noticed where the workers spent most of their time. Not inside the living quarters. Not in the library. Not in the storage buildings. They concentrated almost exclusively on the oldest section beneath the eastern wing of the manor. The foundation. That immediately caught my attention. Professor Henshaw had always insisted that no one disturb that part of the property without proper authorization. He never explained why. Now someone seemed unusually eager to dig beneath it. Curiosity is dangerous when it is driven by emotion. Fortunately, mine was driven by habit. Instead of confronting anyone directly, I decided to verify the facts first. Years of forensic work had taught me the same lesson over and over again. If something looks suspicious, there is almost always a document explaining why. The following morning, I drove to an old municipal archive located nearly 2 hours away. The building had once housed engineering records for several surrounding counties before most public documents were digitized. Few people visited anymore. Dust covered many of the shelves. Cardboard storage boxes filled entire rows of forgotten filing rooms. Fortunately, Professor Henshaw had introduced me to the archive's senior records manager years earlier. She remembered me immediately. "Celine, it's been a long time." "It has. What brings you here?" "I'm looking for historical land records connected to the Henshaw estate." She nodded without asking unnecessary questions. After signing several request forms, she guided me toward a climate-controlled storage room containing original engineering maps dating back more than 70 years. For nearly 3 hours, I examined property surveys, zoning revisions, utility permits, and infrastructure diagrams. Most revealed nothing unusual. Then I unfolded one oversized engineering blueprint dated several decades earlier. A narrow tunnel appeared beneath the eastern side of the manor. It connected to a reinforced underground chamber that did not appear on any modern property survey. Someone had intentionally removed it from later records. That was no accident. The engineering blueprint referenced another file, Government Lease Agreement 19A. I requested it immediately. The records manager returned several minutes later carrying a sealed archival folder. Inside were federal correspondence, maintenance agreements, and legal custody documents. As I carefully read each page, the picture became clearer. Many years earlier, the federal government had leased an underground research chamber beneath the property. The facility was never intended for military use. Instead, it stored environmentally sensitive scientific research and specialized laboratory equipment during a national infrastructure project. When the project ended, Professor Henshaw accepted legal responsibility as the property's official civilian custodian. The agreement required strict preservation of the underground structure until every protected item had been relocated through approved government procedures. I continued reading. 6 months before Professor Henshaw died, every listed asset had already been transferred. Legally.
Completely. Signed.
Verified.
Closed.
I leaned back in my chair. The underground chamber still existed. But according to every official document before me, it was completely empty. Driving back from the archive, I replayed months of conversations in my mind. Draven had rarely asked about family memories. He had never shown genuine interest in Professor Henshaw's historical collections. Instead, his questions always centered on foundations, storage areas, property maps, underground access, and maintenance records. At the time, those questions seemed oddly specific. Now they finally made sense. He hadn't spent years positioning himself to inherit an old manor. He believed something valuable remained hidden beneath it. Whatever rumor he had heard convinced him that the underground chamber still contained government research worth recovering. But every official record proved otherwise. Professor Henshaw had quietly relocated everything before his death. If Draven ordered excavation beneath the manor, he would find reinforced concrete, empty storage rooms,
Dust.
nothing more. For the first time since the funeral, I understood why Professor Henshaw had told me not to fight over the estate. He wasn't protecting me from losing an inheritance. He was protecting me from inheriting someone else's mistake. That evening, I parked outside the manor from a distance where the property remained partially visible through rows of old oak trees. Heavy machinery continued operating near the eastern wing. Portable floodlights illuminated workers digging around the original foundation. Draven stood nearby with folded arms, watching every movement as though he expected the ground itself to reward his patience. He looked determined, confident,
Certain.
I almost felt sorry for him.
Almost.
Because hidden inside my briefcase rested certified copies of every government record I had uncovered that day. Those documents proved one undeniable fact. The heirs believed they had inherited a secret worth millions. In reality, they were digging toward an empty room. 3 days after my visit to the municipal archive, Attorney Malcolm Everidge called me. His voice sounded unusually formal. Ms. Silva, the heirs have requested an emergency meeting regarding the estate. I'll be there. They insist there are serious issues involving the property. I understand. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at the same downtown law office, where Professor Henshaw's will had first been read. When I arrived, the atmosphere was completely different. There were no smiles, no casual conversations. Several family members looked exhausted. Stacks of paperwork covered the conference table. Construction invoices, engineering reports, legal notices, environmental assessments. Draven stood near the window with his arms crossed. His calm confidence had faded. The moment I entered, he looked directly at me. You knew. I knew what? That something wasn't right. I knew Professor Henshaw planned carefully. Don't play games. I never do. Attorney Everidge raised a hand before the discussion could become an argument. We're here to review the legal documents. Nothing more needed to be said. Everyone took their seats. Draven spoke first. The contractors discovered sealed underground structures that were never disclosed during the estate transfer. Attorney Everidge nodded. I'm aware. We've also received multiple notices from environmental agencies requesting immediate compliance. I'm aware of those as well. Draven placed both hands on the conference table. This information should have been disclosed before ownership transferred.
It was.
No, it wasn't. Attorney Everidge calmly opened Professor Henshaw's original estate file. It appears you may have overlooked part of the documentation. Several heirs exchanged nervous glances. One woman quietly whispered that no one had expected legal complications. Another admitted she had signed every document without reading the attached exhibits. The attorney remained patient. There is one final page that becomes relevant only if ownership is disputed after transfer. He removed a folded document from the file. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Professor Henshaw had written the instruction authorizing its release. The room fell completely silent. Attorney Everidge unfolded the page and adjusted his glasses. He looked toward every heir before reading aloud. Every physical structure transferred through this will also transfers full legal responsibility for all environmental restoration obligations attached to Parcel 19A. He stopped. No one spoke. The room remained perfectly still. Even the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. One of the heirs frowned. What does that mean? Attorney Everidge slowly closed the document. It means the ownership transfer includes every legal responsibility associated with the property. Draven stared at him without blinking. Attorney Everidge continued. The environmental restoration orders connected to Parcel 19A remain fully enforceable against the current owners. Another heir shook his head. How much are we talking about? The attorney opened another folder. Based on current agency estimates, the required restoration costs exceed $78 million. Someone gasped. Another person quietly muttered, "That's impossible." It wasn't. Every document had been filed years earlier. Every notice had been properly recorded. Everything was legal. Everything was enforceable. Nothing about this was unexpected. At least not to Professor Henshaw. Questions erupted around the room. Can we reject the inheritance now? Can ownership be reversed? Can the estate absorb the costs? Attorney Everidge answered each question with the same steady professionalism.
No.
The transfer has been completed. The obligations now belong to the registered owners. Draven finally spoke again. Professor Henshaw planned this. The attorney met his eyes. Professor Henshaw repeatedly advised every potential heir to review the estate documents carefully before accepting ownership. Silence followed. I remembered those meetings. He had offered everyone access to the records. He encouraged independent inspections. He even recommended hiring outside legal counsel before making any decision. No one accepted. They were too interested in what they believed the property contained. They never asked what responsibilities came with it. For years, Professor Henshaw had hidden nothing. The truth had always been available. No one had cared enough to read it. The meeting ended without celebration, without victory, without a solution. The heirs left carrying boxes of legal documents instead of renovation plans. Draven remained inside the conference room long after everyone else had gone. He stood motionless beside the table, where Professor Henshaw's final page still rested. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. Not because he had lost money, because he had realized something far more dangerous. Professor Henshaw had anticipated every move long before his death. And if that was true, then perhaps the empty underground chamber was never the real trap. Perhaps the real trap had been convincing greedy people to accept every responsibility attached to the prize they wanted most. I assumed the legal meeting would finally convince Draven to walk away. I was wrong. Less than 48 hours later, I received a phone call from one of the contractors who had previously worked with Professor Henshaw. He recognized my number and sounded uneasy. "Ms. Silva, they're back."
Who?
"The new owners. They've brought excavation equipment again. Weren't the restoration orders supposed to stop all construction? They're ignoring them." I thanked him and ended the call. That decision told me everything I needed to know. Draven no longer cared about renovation. He no longer cared about avoiding lawsuits. He believed something valuable was still hidden underground, despite every official record proving otherwise. Instead of accepting reality, he chose to gamble everything on a rumor. It was the first truly reckless decision I had ever seen him make, and it would become his biggest mistake. By the time I reached the area surrounding the manor, the entrance road had already been blocked. Several federal vehicles were parked beyond the main gate. Uniformed security personnel stood beside temporary barriers. Construction had stopped. Workers gathered in small groups, quietly discussing what had happened. I identified myself before being escorted toward the eastern side of the property. There, standing beside the exposed entrance to the underground chamber, was a woman I had never met. She introduced herself with calm professionalism. "My name is Naomi Vesperhale." She handed me her identification. She served as the director of the National Historical Records Authority. "I've been expecting this day," she said. "You knew someone would try to enter?" She nodded. Professor Henshaw believed they eventually would. Naomi explained that years earlier Professor Henshaw had established a legal notification protocol. If anyone attempted unauthorized access after his death, multiple federal agencies would automatically receive notice through the protected record system. No phone call from me had triggered the investigation. Professor Henshaw had prepared it himself, years in advance. Naomi invited me into a temporary command office established near the site. Large archival boxes covered one side of the room. Inside them were certified government records, transfer receipts, custody logs, facility inspection reports, federal authorization letters. Every document carried official seals and matching reference numbers. Naomi opened one folder after another. Professor Henshaw completed every required transfer 6 months before his passing. Another folder confirmed the dates. Another confirmed the inventory. Another confirmed the receiving agencies. Every protected scientific asset had been removed legally. Nothing remained inside the underground chamber except empty storage space. Naomi smiled slightly. "Your mentor believed facts should always be preserved." He certainly did. That's why he insisted multiple agencies retain identical certified copies. In other words, no one could erase the truth. Not by destroying papers. Not by changing records. Not by making false claims. The documentation existed in too many places. The evidence protected itself. Later that afternoon, federal investigators questioned Draven inside a temporary interview office. I wasn't present during the interview itself, but Naomi later explained the results. Investigators had recovered emails, financial proposals, and encrypted communications from devices seized under warrant. The records painted a completely different picture from the one Draven had presented to the family. He had spent years convincing the heirs that the manor concealed forgotten government technology worth an enormous fortune. His real objective had never been preserving family property. He intended to gain legal access to the underground chamber and secretly broker access to whatever protected research remained inside. He believed international private buyers would pay extraordinary amounts for confidential scientific material. The problem was painfully simple. The material no longer existed. Professor Henshaw had removed it long before. By forcing entry into a federally protected historical site despite multiple legal warnings, Draven had created evidence against himself. The inheritance he had pursued so aggressively had become part of the government's criminal investigation. Everything he tried to obtain now worked against him. As the sun began to set behind the manor, investigators continued documenting every corner of the underground chamber. There were no hidden machines, no secret prototypes, no forgotten fortune waiting beneath the concrete floor. Only empty rooms preserved exactly as the records described. Naomi stood beside me as technicians sealed the entrance, once again. Professor Henshaw understood something most people never learn, she said quietly. What's that? Greed often creates better evidence than honesty ever could. I looked across the property toward Draven. For years, he had built his entire plan around something that no longer existed. And now, every document my mentor had carefully preserved was leading investigators one step closer to proving exactly who Draven really was. Nearly 8 months passed before everything finally came to an end. By then, the headlines had disappeared. The television interviews had stopped. Public attention had shifted elsewhere. The legal consequences, however, were only beginning. Draven Quill Ashcombe faced multiple federal charges related to unlawful entry into a protected government facility, conspiracy involving restricted historical property, and obstruction during the investigation. Several business partners immediately ended their relationships with him. Investors withdrew their support. Projects that once carried his name quietly moved forward without him. His carefully built public reputation collapsed much faster than I expected. The remaining heirs faced a different reality. Because they had accepted ownership of the estate, they also inherited every legal responsibility attached to it. Environmental restoration orders moved forward. Engineering inspections continued. Attorneys negotiated settlements with state and federal agencies for months. Some heirs were forced to sell personal assets simply to cover legal expenses. Others filed separate civil actions against one another, each trying to reduce their share of the financial burden. The fortune they believed they had inherited slowly transformed into years of debt, paperwork, and responsibility. While the heirs struggled with the estate, I focused on the archive box Professor Henshaw had entrusted to me. Inside were thousands of pages of carefully organized research notes, historical correspondence, catalog records, preservation plans, digital storage indexes, letters addressed to museums, draft agreements with universities. Everything reflected the work of a man who believed history belonged to future generations rather than private collections. Following his written instructions, I partnered with several educational institutions to establish the Henshaw Historical Records Foundation. Months of planning eventually turned into reality. Researchers who had once struggled to locate rare documents could now access authenticated records through a properly preserved archive. Students visited regularly. Historians contributed additional collections. The foundation continued growing beyond anything Professor Henshaw and I had imagined years earlier. The manor might have belonged to the heirs. His life's work did not. People occasionally asked whether I regretted refusing to contest the inheritance. My answer never changed. No. If I had fought for the estate, I would have inherited every obligation attached to it. Instead, I honored Professor Henshaw's final request exactly as he intended. Many people assumed he had created an elaborate trap. I saw it differently. He never deceived anyone. Every responsibility had been documented. Every agreement had been properly filed. Every legal obligation was available for review long before ownership changed hands. The heirs simply ignored everything that did not match the outcome they wanted. Greed had narrowed their attention until they could no longer recognize the difference between opportunity and liability. Professor Henshaw didn't punish them. Their own choices did. One cool autumn afternoon, I returned to the manor one last time. Most of the construction equipment had disappeared. Large sections of the property were fenced off while environmental restoration continued under government supervision. The once grand entrance looked quieter than I had ever seen it. I walked slowly through the front garden before stopping near the library windows where Professor Henshaw and I had spent countless evenings examining old records together. For a few moments, I simply stood there, not mourning the building, remembering the man. I finally understood why he had smiled during our last conversation. He knew people would reveal themselves once they believed something valuable was waiting for them. He trusted the truth to outlast ambition. As I turned toward my car, I realized I wasn't leaving anything important behind. Everything that truly mattered had already been preserved. If this experience taught me anything, it is this. The most expensive mistake is not wanting too much. It is refusing to understand what comes attached to what you want. I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they demanded. The manor, the land, the buildings, every legal document, every responsibility, every consequence. When their lawyer read that single sentence aloud, their celebration ended before they even realized it had begun. Justice did not arrive through revenge. It arrived through patience, preparation, and the simple power of reading the truth that had been there all along. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If you enjoyed this legal mystery filled with twists, hidden truths, and satisfying consequences, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment surprised you the most? I'll see you in the next story.